Welcome to Take the Lead Radio with Dr. Diane Hamilton, where she interviews some of the most successful leaders, entrepreneurs, authors, speakers, and other individuals who will inspire you to take the lead in your career and personal life. And now, here is Dr. Diane Hamilton.
I am here with Tom Kolditz, who is an American retired brigadier general, an educator, author, and consultant. He became the director of the Leader Development Program at the Yale School of Management and is the founding director of the Anne and John Doerr Institute for the New Leaders at Rice University. His book, In Extremist Leadership, Leading as If Your Life Depended on It, is based on more than 175 interviews taken on the ground in Iraq during combat operations. General Kolditz has been a skydiving instructor and has served as the senior instructor for West Point Sport Parachute Team. He's a recipient of multiple awards. I think I would have to spend the rest of the show to list them, so I think we'll just continue from here because I'm really interested in what you've done. Welcome. It's so nice to have you here.
Yeah, thanks, Diane. It's great to be here.
Well, I'm really fascinated in what you do, and it's an honor to interview someone who's done so much for our country and to help so many others succeed. And I've watched some of your speeches you've given, and I'm very fascinated in your work with failure because, well, in general, I'm writing a book about curiosity, and the 4 factors that I think impede our ability to be curious at times, and failure is a big part of that. So I hope you don't mind if we talk about that a lot today. I'm very fascinated in your work.
No, I'd love to talk about that. I think I agree with you. I think it tends to grind off people's enthusiasm for risk-taking and for entrepreneurship, and I think we should be more in touch with what we get from our failures.
Well, I think it's really a interesting area of work because it's kind of hard to research. What I found creating my curiosity assessment is how hard it is to come up with the questions that really can capture what you want to capture. And I was interested in the 3 questions you were asking in a group that you spoke to recently and how you came up with them. So first of all, before we get into those questions, what led to your interest in studying failure? I mean, you've got this amazing background, and just can you give some of your background and what led to all this?
Well, in the military, I ran a lot of organizations, and I was responsible for people's actions. And when you do that, and when you're in the real world, things go wrong, and you can interpret that as failure. And I had plenty to learn from. And then when I transitioned out of the military, and I started working at Yale, and traveling around speaking with companies that were hiring people out of top-tier universities, I discovered this population of people who almost never fail. I mean, they don't have much experience with it, and I found that they're very insecure about it. They're afraid of it. They don't understand it. They assume that the first time they fail, their whole life is going to be over, and as a result, they hold back sometimes. And having lived in organizations and knowing that things go wrong and bad things happen, I was kind of fascinated by the fact that these people who were in these top tier universities and important business settings were so inexperienced at it, and were allowing themselves to be influenced by that fear.
Well, I've gone to so many meetings where they've changed the way we look at fear. I mean, I'm from the boomer generation, and we didn't look at failure as such a great thing in the past. Failure, it was really, you didn't want to ever deal with at work because you were going to get in trouble. And now when I go to these meetings and they talk about failure, they look at it as more of a learning experience, and I'm glad to see that. But I think what's interesting in what you're saying is this group, this population, the Ivy League kind of people that have done so wonderfully and everything to get to where they are, and then now they've got to deal with that. It's not your typical, population, though, when you get out in the working world. And so I mean, it is in the higher levels. I shouldn't say it isn't, but in general, you get people from all over that get into leadership positions that maybe didn't go to Harvard or Yale or some of those top universities, but they don't want to fail either. So it's something that people are worried about, because you've experienced this problem if you have failed in the past, and then you get this, I don't want to go through that again. Is it almost worse to have failed or not to have failed in the past?
I hate failure. I think that it's painful. It's disruptive. And so, I don't approach this issue of failure in a cooperative way, but I'm a realist. And in reality, failures are going to happen. And the real trick to surviving them, I think, is first of all, not trying to dodge responsibility for them, but changing the conversation into something that's forward-looking rather than backward-looking. And in many work settings, anytime anything goes wrong, there's a tremendous amount of finger pointing and dodging of responsibility. And that is destructive to the organization. But when you can create an organization where people will take a failure and analyze it in a forward-looking way so that it doesn't happen again, and where there's a presumption of competence among people in the organization, then the organization can learn and move forward. And I think if there's one thing that saved me across multiple failures that I had, was that I was in groups of people where there was a presumption of competence. These were high-performing military units, and when something bad happened, we assumed it was because of circumstances or because of the enemy or because of, something else. And then we took action to make sure that we wouldn't get hurt that way again. But we didn't just assume that it was because of an incompetent person, because we didn't look at each other that way.
Right. Well, it's a different world. I teach for different universities, and one of them is a military university, with military students, I should say. And you get these different perspectives on this. And I came from a very competitive family, so I mean, failure, I'm with you. I hate failure. It's really tough. But I found it interesting when you were talking about the different questions you asked, that you got bimodal responses to some of them. Can we go over some of those questions and how you came up with them and why you think you got the kind of responses you got? Because received, I should say. Your first question that you asked people, as I wrote it down, if I do poorly at something, I usually prefer not to let anyone know. And then people had to respond everywhere from agree to strongly disagree on that. What were you trying to get out of that question, and how did you come up with that question?
So all three of the questions that we're going to talk about are single items from fear of failure personality measures. And so what they're designed to do is detect in individuals an uncommon fear of failure. So we would expect in most populations for any personality trait to be normally distributed, the classic kind of normal distribution. But what I find with audiences when I do this fear of failure measure is that the distributions are almost bimodal. There's a group at the bottom and then a group at the top. And what that tells me is that either because of some early experience or inherent qualities of personality, that there is a group of people out there who have a much stronger fear of failure than their peers. And what the research shows is that fear of failure is mostly generated through parenting. Right. And in particular, parenting by mothers.
I found that interesting.
And yeah, so I'm always interested in helping to identify those individuals and kind of raise their own awareness of their fear of failure, because once you have a meta awareness of it, you can do something about it. You can make different decisions, you can check yourself, and so that's one of the reasons why I use those questions.
Okay, so let's just the other questions were when I compete with someone who seems better than me, I sort of give up trying. And then the third question was I sometimes avoid difficult tasks because I'm afraid of making mistakes. So these are all things that I'm kind of looking at with the curiosity element in a way, if they're fearing failure. So maybe discuss some of those things. I agree. You got to figure out what's holding you back. And if you figure out your fear of failure is holding you back, how do you get over that fear? Then what do you do?
Well, I think one of the really important aspects of learning to live with failure is learning to, publicly and unapologetically take credit for that failure. Mm-hmm. As long as we're trying to wriggle out or, dodge responsibility or the spotlight, we never really face up to the fact that these things are going to happen. And I found it pretty empowering over the years when things would go badly to simply say right off the bat, this is my fault. Mm-hmm. And I know how to fix it. And, it makes it very difficult for other people to, kind of go after you when you fully admit. I mean, they no longer have to convince you that you were the cause of the failure. You've said, I did it. And here's the important part about that in leader development, and that's really what I do. I develop leaders.
Right.
If a leader says that a bad thing that happened was not their responsibility, then what they're saying is they have no control over it. Mm-hmm. And once a leader abdicates control, they're powerless. But as soon as you admit responsibility for something bad that happens and you say, I should have made different decisions or I should have done different things so that wouldn't happen. Well, essentially what you're saying is, I got this. Mm-hmm. I can, as a leader, I can control this and I can make things better. So I always counsel leaders, never point fingers at other people and say that, the bad thing that happened in your organization was due to them, because when you do that, you've essentially told everyone you're not in charge, that mm-hmm. that other circumstances are in charge of the outcomes in your organization. And that's a terrible position for a leader to be in, much worse than
right.
the position of saying this bad thing happened and it was my responsibility and my fault.
Well, I like that you focus on understanding interpersonal and interpersonal skills, and some of the stuff I was listening to you talk about, because I wrote my dissertation on emotional intelligence, and those are such important aspects, I think, in terms of leadership. And you were talking about if you talk to a group that people need to understand themselves and how others view them, so that you can you understand how to say the right things. If you're dealing with somebody you don't understand how to relate with them, how do you help people in that respect?
I try to reframe things for them. Mm-hmm. I try to show them that there's a different way of seeing themselves, and this came rushing to the forefront for me under circumstances where I was actually being coached. And the coach had asked me what I wanted to work on. And my circumstances were such that I was in a difficult startup with a lot of performance demands. I had a very sick child. I had a daughter that was on a heart transplant list. Wow. I had, tremendous pressures. And I said, I really feel like I need to work on my resilience. I just don't think I'm very resilient. I'm not dealing with this really the way that I ought to. And the coach looked at me for a second and she said, okay, let me get this straight. She said, you're performing in your job, you're getting things done, you're able to handle these medical circumstances, from a distance, getting on and off planes once a week to go be supportive, and you're getting all this done. She said, what do you think resilience looks like?
Huh.
And that was a pretty powerful thing for that coach to say to me, because what it was doing is it was asking, it was teaching me to see myself through the eyes of other people. And that allowed me to get a better understanding of sort of who I was and what I was good at and what I was not good at. So, I think they're really important. This meta-awareness of how other people view you is just really important in all kinds of ways. And obviously, I wasn't trying to influence that coach. That coach was trying to influence me. But by reflecting that back on me, it gave me tremendous personal insight. And I was appreciative for that.
Well, I mean, that's such an interesting story, and I think so many people are afraid of letting other people down, and I've had so many people on the show who pretty much agreed with what I've had a few consultants say, as far as leaders often think that people know more than they know, or are stronger than they think they are, I think that a lot of us in leadership positions don't want people to know that we have any kind of sense of that we don't have it all under control. You know what I mean? But it's human nature to have those feelings, isn't it?
It is. And, leaders need to be reminded of that. My organization, I've just built out this startup leader development enterprise at Wright. And a few months ago, we were going through an organization development process, and people around the room were putting up on the wall with stickies and butcher paper charts sort of what their responsibilities were and what they felt they needed in order to perform. And so I was there doing my little chart, putting down the things that I was responsible for, developing donors and designing the programs and so forth. And then in the list of things that I said that I needed, I said something along the lines of, I need to know every once in a while that what I'm doing is working and that it's effective and that people appreciate that. And my folks who were in the room at the time were really surprised by that. They said, it didn't occur to us that you needed some support. We keep asking for your support, and you're a leader, so you're supposed to know what we need. And it didn't even occur to us that you need stuff too. And so, I often counsel leaders, over and over again, be kind to yourself. A lot of us who step up to these leader roles are our own worst critics, and we beat ourselves up all the time. And every once in a while, we just need to step back and just be a little kind to ourselves. Not in a self-congratulatory way,
right?
But just take a breath and say, all right, I'm doing the best I can, and things are going pretty well, and now on to the next thing. But people don't do that, and Diane, I think all of us are really shocked and concerned about the increase of suicides in our country right now.
Yeah.
And, part of that is people just beating themselves up and not going to other people for any kind of support.
It is so important to have support, and it's something that, I think leaders need to surround themselves with people who don't know everything. You can't know everything, right? And I think you put so much pressure on yourself to know all these things. But, I had Keith Kroc on my show, who's the the chairman of DocuSign, and he was talking, which kind of supported what you were saying. A lot came from his mother on his curiosity. She had a great influence on him, but he was saying, that he surrounds himself, of course, with people who know the things, that he can't know. You can't know everything. And do you think leaders kind of just think that they need to know everything? I mean, you can't be a CFO and a CEO and everything. It's challenging, but how do you surround yourself with the people who know what you don't know? And if you don't know enough about that, know that you've picked the right people. You know what I'm saying?
Sure. I mean, I don't think I've ever met a leader who didn't have a little bit of insecurity about their experience and abilities. And when I have met those kind of leaders, they've been headed for a fall because they're so overconfident and so arrogant that it's destructive to them. Leaders start out. I mean, I worked at West Point for 12 years in the leadership department there. And so I talked to a lot of young people who were really concerned because, they were going to be 22 years old. They were going to have 30 or 40 people in a platoon, and a lot of them were going to be, 35 to 45-year-old sergeants who'd been to combat multiple times. And they were always concerned about not knowing everything and not knowing, what those other people know. And I always told them that, first of all, you should be good at and understand the things that you're supposed to be good at. And for those young lieutenants, it was the basics of being a soldier in many respects. How to take a machine gun apart, how to use the instruments inside a tank or artillery pieces, and how to order supplies and get things. But at the same time, I told them that as long as you knew the things you were supposed to know, people would support you with their knowledge and their ability because they see that as their role. And the only time that leaders run into trouble with not knowing something is if they don't admit it.
Right.
They begin to operate as if they do know everything. And of course, it's very transparent that they don't. And so people lose respect for them, and they have problems. I mean, the higher you go in organizations, the more people around you are going to have deep technical knowledge in their areas that you couldn't possibly match.
Right.
And so you have to be really good at listening and really good at spotting phonies.
How do you do that?
Well, I guess it's partly experience.
Uh-huh.
I think when you've listened to people talk about their work, I think the insecurities and the deflection and the deceit, begin to pop out. I mean, you can tell when you're being sold a bill of goods if you've listened to this kind of thing for many times, and so I think that kind of enhanced listening is a really important leader skill, and hand in glove with that is the ability to ask intelligent questions.
Right.
A leader that walks in the room and just says, "Hey, how are things going?" I mean, what do they expect? People are going to say it's going fine.
Right.
But when you ask pointed questions about an individual's area, are they getting the resources they need? Are they accomplishing the goals that they have? Do they have goals? What are their goals? That kind of pointed questioning is really important in terms of uncovering, talent and, people that aren't doing so well. Because if you just breeze through your organization with this sort of superficial chit-chat kind of questioning, you won't know anything about what's going on.
Right.
So I think all of us need to pay attention to the kinds of questions we ask in the workplace.
Well, I think in how you ask, the tone makes a difference to me. It's interesting because I've interviewed other brigadier generals. I don't know if you know Olin Odakoven, but I know him pretty well, and I've interviewed him, and he has the same kind of tone to me that you have, in this just humble kind of quality that you wouldn't expect from somebody who has achieved what you have achieved, and I'm just curious, how much. I mean, how do you get to that level where you've done a lot in your life, but you still have this real approachability? You say your mother had an influence, and I'm sorry you said that she recently passed, and I'm very sorry to hear that. But I'm curious to hear what kind of impact you think she had maybe on that.
I grew up in a town of 1,800 people in southern Illinois. And in a town like that, there's virtually no anonymity. Everyone knows everyone else. There's very little privacy. If you do something, the windows are open and the neighbors know, and then everybody knows.
Right.
I just told a group of boys at Texas Boys State. I was talking to them about lying, and I said, in the town where I grew up, if you lied to someone, they would talk about it for 5 years and remember it for 50. It's that kind of close community that begins to put demands on you. And in my mother's case, she was a nurse, and she stopped working as a nurse to take care of my little brother and I. But but that didn't mean she stopped nursing. In a small town like that, there's uneven access to medical care, and there's, a lot of need by elderly people and sick people, and she just went around taking blood pressures and giving injections and doing whatever needed to be done for that whole community. And in the process of that, I got exposed to people with a lot of different capacities, people that had physical challenges, and sometimes people that were not really bright, hadn't not only didn't have education, but also had just some mental challenges. And so I was taught at a really early age, look, all of us have our challenges, and it's our job to kind of take care of each other. And then as I grew as a leader and started running organizations, it was pretty easy for me to accept this notion that leaders are there to help take care of other people and to make people's lives better and organizations better, and that it really was not about me. It's really not about, personal advocacy or advancement. And I get frustrated sometimes with the sort of the leader development enterprise, speaking broadly.
Right.
Because so much of it is individual self-promotion.
Yeah.
And I don't begrudge people that, because many people operate as individual consultants and, coaches and things. But it sometimes leads to this perception that being a leader is also, sort of this brand making, individual promotion, when in fact it should be just about the opposite. Leaders should work really hard to make themselves obsolete in the organization. They should work hard to make sure that the organization begins to learn by itself, run itself, has a collective set of values. And if a leader has to physically be there all the time for that to happen, then they're failing in some way. All of that needs to be put into the organization, and then eventually the leader can move on and do other things and feel good about the fact that they've left a legacy. One of the things I learned as a pretty young officer, I learned from a guy named Doc Bonson. He was a one-star general, and he's very bombastic, and he did a lot of his work in Vietnam, and he felt like the Army had been sort of sterilized away from the realities of the fact that it's built to kill people. That's a big part of being a soldier is being willing to use violence. And but he had these great ideas about leadership, and one of the things he told me early on that's really inspired me is that you can do a lot of things in life that seem to matter. You can make lots of money, you can write books, you can build buildings, you can create companies, and almost all of that will go away in your lifetime. The books become irrelevant, nobody reads them anymore, the buildings get renamed or torn down or renovated or what have you, he said. But when you can put your mark and your impact on the development of other people, when you can change other people's lives for the better, that pays forward forever. And he argued that developing people is the only lasting legacy that a leader can really produce. And I've always been inspired by that, and so that's why I spend most of my time now trying to do some form of leader development.
Well, you have done some amazing work with that, and your book is really a great book, and I think a lot of people could learn so much from what you've done, and I was hoping you would share how they could find out more about your work and your book.
Well, my book's pretty easy. It's on Amazon, and it's about, how we learn about leadership from watching people who lead in dangerous places. And, the managerial aspects of running organizations get stripped away when people are afraid. Yeah. And so that's kind of what the book's about. It's had a lot of applicability in the banking sector during its crisis, and for others, not just military or police or firefighters, but people who have to face personal crises. And I'll also tell you that I have never taken a dime of royalties from that book. I defer all the royalties to two nonprofits, the West Point Association of Graduates and the Francis Hesselbein Institute in New York City, which is a social sector leadership institute. So that's how you can get, involved with that book, is to simply read it. And then, the other work that I'm doing now at Rice, I'm very passionate about. It's a startup. In January 2016, there were 2 people working here. Now we have 87 in various capacities, and we develop about a third of the university's students, graduate and undergraduate. We take the approach that really everyone who comes to a university should get the kind of high quality leader development that they would get in a company. And so we use only professional people, professional coaches. We offer a professional leadership coach to every student in the school who wants it, which is a remarkable benefit for this university.
Do you do anything with soft skills with that? I mean, is it what kind of skills are you developing? I'm just curious.
So we let the students tell us what they need. So we give them some emotional intelligence measures and EQI and some other things. And then they sit down for a 90-minute first session with their coach, and they create a developmental plan that's tailored to each individual student. And so the student can sort of define what leadership is for them. They can work on making their strengths more impactful, or they can work on remediating some deficiencies if they feel that they have them. And all of it's tailored to the individual, and that allows us to move around the university and deal with the levels of diversity that we have here. 30% of our students are international students that we work with. We work with men, we work with women, and we are fanatical measurers of outcomes. So in our organization, we have a research psychologist who runs a team, and their only function is to measure outcomes. They don't have to create programs or fix programs. They just tell us whether the programs are having a measurable impact on students' capacity to lead. And that has been game-changing.
I imagine.
Because most universities do a lot of things that they claim are leader development.
Right.
But they don't measure outcomes. And in fact, when you look at the types of things, the little retreats and the workshops and the leaders, motivational speakers and things, most of that doesn't add up to a hill of beans. It really doesn't matter very much. But it's entertaining.
Yeah.
And universities spend hundreds of millions of dollars on those kinds of activities every year. But because they're not measuring their outcomes, they're not necessarily aware of what they aren't getting for their money. For the price of one good leadership speaker, I can give 40 or 50 students a professional coach for a whole semester each.
Okay, so those coaches are professors, or who are these coaches?
No, these are professional coaches from the Houston business community. So these are the same people that are coaching senior vice presidents in firms and C-level leaders. And what we have found is that mentors or professors or other people, they do their jobs pretty well, and they're okay for career development, teaching an engineer how to get into an engineering company, let's say. But when it comes to leader development, they're just not very good.
Yeah.
they're just not good at it, and they can't compete with a coach who's been certified by the International Coach Federation, has a master's degree in organizational psychology, and has coached, 40 executives more than 1,500 sessions. And that's the kind of person we have working one-on-one with students. And so professionalism makes all the difference in the world in terms of getting measured outcomes. And we are transforming students' lives here at large scale. We've coached, in the last 18 months, we've coached more than 1,400 students.
Wow.
And so...
Well, what are you measuring? I mean, what kind of outcomes are you looking for, and how are you measuring them?
So we look at 3 different types of outcomes, behavioral, cognitive, and emotional. And so the behavioral outcomes that we pay attention to are 21 behavioral competencies, observable competencies that we tend to work with students on, not all 21 at once. A student might be working
Right.
on one or two competencies. We also measure leader identity as a cognitive variable, and we're really interested in that. We think it's probably the most important thing to produce, is this degree of self-confidence and self-awareness in a young person that, hey, I'm a leader. I could run a company. I could build a nonprofit. I can lead my family through a tragedy.
Right.
Just this awareness that they can lead. And then emotionally, and you said that you've studied emotional intelligence, so you kind of understand the things that we're looking at there, the ability to control one's own emotions, the ability to influence the emotions of other people. And we measure that, and sometimes coaches work on that with students.
You mentioned
So those
EQI.
are the things that we measure.
Do you use the EQI?
Pardon?
You mentioned the EQI earlier. Is that the instrument you use? Because that's what I used in my research. Or do you use something else to measure emotional intelligence?
Well, predominantly we use the EQI. We've also found some special applications for the Myers-Salivey-Caruso emotional intelligence test, the Mesquite.
Yeah, that's a good one too.
Yeah.
So you've got the best.
It's a little more cumbersome to use, but it's also, in my view, the gold standard. If you really want to measure it and have a deep understanding of it. So,
well, it's
so those are the things that we measure, and we measure them ruthlessly. And if we have a program or a process that is not creating measurable differences in those things, we immediately stop. And when we have something that does produce those, we throw more money at it. It's really pretty simple.
How much time do you give
it's
it
just
before you
honesty.
stop? How much time do you give something before you stop? How do you determine if it's working or not?
So we'll do usually one small scale pilot, 12 people, and then we'll do a larger scale pilot to really test our system. So in our coaching program, the larger pilot was 266 students. And then we open it up, and we work very hard to accommodate every student that wants our kind of developmental experience. Most leadership programs, try to find like the 20 best student leaders, or, people have to compete to get into them. We are disrupting that whole thing. We think that if a student goes to a great college or university, that in addition to getting an education, they ought to be developed as leaders in a professional way. Not just the hokey leadertainment stuff, but, serious development like they would get if they were in a company that was working on high potentials. Because at Rice University, every one of our students is a high potential. We don't think of any of them as a non-high potential student.
Do they all have to be in Houston to get this? Do you do any virtual, or is it all on campus?
No, we've done some virtual coaching, and it's actually pretty successful. Students say that they prefer face-to-face coaching, but when we actually measure the outcomes of the coaching, there's very little difference between coaching by Skype or coaching face-to-face.
Right.
And so we have students that are sometimes on really important developmental experiences that are not in Houston, and the typical example of that would be a semester abroad.
Right.
And we have taken steps to give coaches to students who are not in the country, and it works fine. And the other thing we do, when we spot a student who's engaged in something that could be highly developmental, like being an activist, Black Lives Matter, pro-choice rights. We have a young lady now who's working hard to get bicycle rules changed to lower the number of bicycle fatalities in Houston. We always reach out to student activists and offer them a professional coach, regardless of sort of what their, sense of advocacy is. We don't care what their topic is. We just want them to have a great developmental experience while they're, passionately working in their activist role. So we do that as well.
Well,
as a form of outreach.
You mentioned 21 behaviors when you look at their behavioral things. What are the top behavioral issues that you think you need to work on to get people to be good leaders?
Self-confidence, self-control, assertiveness. Those are probably the three biggest, competencies. And we use as a start point for identifying competencies the validated competencies that Korn Ferry have put together in their work. We really like their work, and so we use that as a start point.
Okay.
And then we pulled a lot of knowledgeable people, and we kind of focus group it and say, okay, here's what we really want to concentrate on.
Mm-hmm.
But at the end of the day, it's up to students to tell us what they want to work on. As soon as you make this sort of stock leadership definition, it just creates an enormous food fight among academics. I mean, everybody wants to argue definitions, and it's really not useful. So we don't do that.
Right.
We focus on leader development rather than defining leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And we just make sure that we're helping people along the way, that they are in fact advancing. And right now in the coaching program, the number of students, or the percentage of students who would recommend the experience to other students, either recommend or strongly recommend, is like 98%.
Wow.
I mean, it is a remarkable satisfaction rate. And of course, we care more about outcomes, behavioral and cognitive outcomes, than we do with satisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
But if we weren't producing those outcomes, I guarantee you that students would not be satisfied. The time is the coin of the realm here. And if you waste students' time, you're done.
Is this all undergrad, grad, and I'm also curious about, you mentioned that they picked the work on the things that they like, which brings to mind like RAS StrengthsFinder. Do you think that you sometimes feel comfortable working on the things you're already good at? And what do you think about that? Do you work on the things that you're good at or not?
Yeah, we're big believers in that for students. Most of our students are pretty talented in a lot of ways. And the way I deal with that anecdotally with them is I say, think of your favorite professional athlete. Take Big Papi, David Ortiz in the Boston Red Sox. Incredible hitter. This guy has biceps the size of my thighs. You don't go to Big Papi and say, you're really not a very good pitcher, so let's work on your pitching deficiency. Instead, you give him 2 or 3 batting coaches, and you make him the very best batter on that team.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what we do with strengths with our students. If we have a student who is a really good communicator, we teach them how to use that communications ability as a super strength in their leadership. And if we have a student that isn't that kind of extroverted communicator, but they tend to be more introverted and analytical, we can teach them how to kind of keep their mouth shut until they've really figured out an answer for an issue, and then how to pronounce that, to drop that on the group in a way that's impactful. And everybody in the room turns to them and they're like, holy cow, this person's waters really run deep.
Yeah.
And so you can take almost any strength and turn it into a powerful leadership tool. It's much easier than trying to remediate, because if you have somebody that's a C- or a D in communication, you can work with them a lot. You might be able to get them to a C+ or a B-, but it'll never be powerful for them.
Mm-hmm.
And so better to work on a strength and teach them how to use it as a tool than try to remediate the things that we're not that great at.
Well, what about interpersonal relationships, emotional intelligence-based issues, though? If they lack interpersonal skills, what do you focus on that?
Well, I think sometimes when we frame how a person interacts with other people as lacking interpersonal skills, I think more what it is they're unaware of their skills, or it's harder for them to communicate, in ways that consider where that other person is. And so I do think we can make terrific improvements in students' abilities in terms of interpersonal influence. And that's really what we teach. I mean, if we had to come up with a stock definition of leadership, it's going to be some form of interpersonal influence. That's the approach we take. Many of us here in the Institute are psychologists. I'm a social psychologist. Our metrics person is a research-oriented social psychologist. We work with anthropologists. We have sociologists, org behavior, industrial organizational psychologists. So all of us are about psychological influence in some way. Mm-hmm. And that's what we try to teach our students.
Well, that would be fascinating. My work as the MBA program chair, I looked at a lot of the things that you guys are talking about there. And now, did you say this was undergrad, grad? And I'm curious if you see any differences in the male and the female, in how their outcomes. Is there any difference that you're seeing?
Yeah, so it is both graduate and undergraduate students. There are 7 schools at Rice, so business, architecture, music, humanities, social sciences, natural sciences, and engineering. And we work with all those students. Mm-hmm. We're not under a dean. We work for the president of the university. Huh. So, and in terms of women, that's a huge good news story for us, because when our metrics team does the pre-testing of the student populations, women are significantly below men on the measures that we're looking for as indicators of leadership. But almost without exception, when women finish with coaching or with one of our other programs, they have fully caught up to the men. There's no difference. And it's been really inspiring for us, because one of the things that would be really difficult for us is if we had to run a lot of single demographic programs, women's programs, first generation college student programs, international student programs. Yeah. But what we find is when you work with people one-on-one, that's the highest level of diversity you can get. And so, people's needs wind up being met by these professional leader developers. And so you don't need these single demographic programs. They're cumbersome and they're expensive, and at the end of the day, they're really unnecessary if you have a program that offers, intense one-on-one experiences. So we don't plan to do any of those. We plan to keep working at the individual level of diversity and being effective at that. We've also had great success, I'll say, with international students. They pattern much like the women, where at the beginning they're below the mean, but by the time they're finished with the programs, they're fully caught up. And for many of them, they come from cultures where it's not a perception that leaders could be developed. It's a perception that leaders have to be appointed, they have to be part of a family, whatever. And for them, when they discover, my goodness, I can actually get better at this, and I didn't think leadership was in the cards for me, but now they're telling me I can run my own company. Wow. It's really fulfilling to talk to young people like that, whether they come from China or Mexico or Korea or wherever our international student population's from.
Can you have this program just completely virtual, or is it just still they have to actually go to Houston?
No, I mean, we're figuring out ways to go more virtually. Specifically, we have a coach training course that we developed that's accredited by the International Coach Federation for business coaches, that we have taught several times to groups of 20 or more students, so that our students literally have the same kind of coaching skills that you would begin to find in relatively young coaches in the business community. And we're going to figure out a way to export that. That's no awesome. Other school does that. There are no other opportunities for students to get that level of coach training. Yeah. I mean, there may be like a weekend workshop or something, but that's really that's really the bane of the whole leader development industry, is that it's too little, too cheap, too unprofessional, and it just doesn't
Yeah.
It doesn't have impact at that level.
Well, I would love to hear more about that when you guys come up with that. I know a lot of people are trying to expand internationally and virtually, and trying to develop that kind of reach in a meaningful way, like what you're talking about. And all the stuff you're doing is so fascinating. I could keep you here for the whole day. All the stuff I'm interested in is all the stuff you do. So, but I know we probably gotta probably let you go here. But I wanted to. Is there any websites you want to share, or any information you'd like to share? We talked about that you can get the book on Amazon. Do you have anything else that you'd share?
Yeah, I'll share one other thing. I told you that we are huge into measurement, in terms of our programming, and then also in terms of our own organization, how to run the organization. And the reason we're here is because of a highly successful Rice graduate named John Doerr. John and his wife Ann, both Rice graduates. And John Doerr is a venture capitalist who put the money under Google and Twitter and Intuit and Amazon. And, he has picked these incredible companies to build. And he has a brand new book out called Measure What Matters. It's a New York Times bestseller. It came out 2 weeks ago. It is one of the best leadership books I've ever read.
Wow.
It basically talks about how to create a goal-setting culture in an organization. And he did that with Google. He did it with Bono's foundation. He's now on the Obama Foundation. He's been really the Johnny Appleseed of how to set goals in organizations and make them motivational, rather than tied to compensation or the old style management by yelling at people once a year and that sort of thing. So it's a terrific book. He's got a TED Talk out on it. And I would also point to that as a great opportunity for people to learn something new about leadership, because most leadership, I have hundreds and hundreds of leadership books, and,
yeah,
2/3 of them are the same. Right. They don't really break any new ground. But this Measure What Matters focus is completely new and really impactful.
Well, I'll be buying that. Thanks for the tip. This is it's a great. This has been so much fun. I really enjoyed it. It's very educational, and I was really looking forward to having you here. Thank you so much for being on the show.